Hi, I'm Amy Rowe, and I'm going to talk to you today about test taking. So, this presentation is going to more focus on systems that you can put in place to make sure that you're being successful when you take exams. I'm not really going to talk about test taking anxiety and how to combat that. That's a topic for another presentation. For this one, I just want to have you have some systems in place so that you can attack your exam sort of methodically, because that's really going to benefit you in the long run. So, the first thing that I want you to do is ask for scratch paper and do a brain dump. This is before you even get your exam or look at your exam. I want you to turn the exam over and take your scratch paper, and I want you to write down all your formulas or your formulas, which is what I wrote there, but I meant formulas. Write down all your formulas, your key terms, your vocabulary, dates, places, people, everything that you're afraid that you're going to forget. I used to even do like very abbreviated outlines for my essays, and then I would memorize those outlines. So I would always, before I took a test, I would kind of write out those outlines. So what this is going to do for you is it's going to take a lot of anxiety off you. And I just said I wasn't going to talk about anxiety, but I am going to talk about it in this matter, because a lot of the time when we're taking tests, the adrenaline rush that we get at the beginning continues on through because we're always afraid we're going to forget something. So we know we've maybe memorized something specifically, but we haven't gotten to it yet. So we're nervous about that. This takes all of that away. This allows you to write down all the things that you knew you didn't want to forget. And now you can breathe because they're all there for you and you can go back and look at them when you need to. The second thing I want you to do is just quickly look through the test. I want you to look and see if certain things look familiar to you. I want you to note how long it is and what kinds of questions there are. I want you to note if certain questions might look like they take longer. I want you to look at the instructions really specifically. So I want you to pay attention to, are some sections worth more points than others? Are you penalized for not answering things? And make sure you read your questions to the end. I'm sure we've all seen those little videos where, only one person reads all the instructions, and the last instruction is, if you read all the way to the end, you don't have to take the test, just turn it in, right? Like, don't be that person. So make sure you read all the instructions to the end, because there's not going to be an excuse when your teacher grades your tests. If your professor says, no, sorry, you didn't read the instructions, that's it. That's the end. So that's why the instructions are there, for you to follow them. And I also want you to look at the timing, or think about the timing. So I want you to think about the total number of questions you have. And so maybe they're all multiple choice questions. Maybe you have 30 questions. Maybe you have 60 minutes. So then in your head, you can be like, okay, well, maybe I'll try and do 2 minutes per question. If there's different sections, so maybe there's a section that's essay, section that's multiple choice, section that's true false, then adapt that. I know I would want to leave the most amount of time for the essay questions. So I would have a time in my head that I would want to be at those essay questions. Because here's the thing, if you have to guess at things, you're better off guessing and like quickly writing down answers for true falses or multiple choices that are only worth a point or two. For longer, short answer or essay questions, they're bound to be worth more. So maybe focus on making sure you have time to get those things done. And considering that, really decide what order you want to do the questions in. So I'm a firm believer in do the hardest and most points first. Get those done out of the way when you have the most energy, the most adrenaline, get those done. And then go back and do easier, shorter questions. But not every person is like that. So some students like to just get done with what's easy, and then that gives them a sense of accomplishment. They feel good about that, and then they can go on and do the harder questions. And a lot of times, sometimes doing the shorter answer questions, those might prime your brain a little bit for the topics and maybe help you remember things that you might want to write in your essays. So just kind of think about the way that you like to approach things, and then that's how you decide what order to do things. But you do not need to do your test in the order that the pages come. You get to decide this. So, a couple tips for multiple choice, true, false, and essays. So, for multiple choice, if it's a long vignette, read the last question first. So, a vignette is like a little paragraph. Oftentimes, it will kind of set up a scenario, and then the last question will say, what's the next step that George should take? So if you look at the last question first, what's the next step that George should take? Then you know before you even start reading that, that that's what you're going to focus on while you're actually reading. So you're in your head, you're like, okay, so I know that all the clues are leading to me knowing what's his next step. So reading that last question first can sometimes be a very powerful method. But sometimes you don't really have that option to because it's like a shorter question. So I also want you to watch for qualifiers. So always, never, all, none. Those are things that I want you to pay attention to. I don't want you to listen to people who say never choose it. If it says always, if it's got a qualifier in it, then it's never the answer. That's not true. But you do need to pay attention to that because those words are pretty powerful words. So if something isn't always the case, then don't choose that as the answer. You should also make sure that, again, as part of the instructions, it's going to tell you if answers are multi-select or not. So the difference between multi-select and multiple choice is multiple choice, you choose one answer. Multi-select, you might have to choose multiple answers. So it will say something like, choose all that are true. So make sure that you're watching for that because sometimes in some classes, you need to do that. And in order to get credit for the answer, you need to choose every single answer that applies to that. I want you to read each option and then compare it back to your question. So don't just skim through the answers and then pick something and move on. Read each option, think about the question, and then if you can cross it out, cross it out. Look, I spelled something wrong again. It says if you can cross out optons. Okay, if you can cross out options, cross them out because that is really helpful for your brain to just eliminate things that are distractions to you. And also, here's a little trick and key for you. If an answer is partly wrong, it's all wrong. So if it says do this step and this step, and one of those steps is right and one of those steps is wrong, then that answer is wrong. So even if that means you have to choose something that you're not familiar with, you don't even know, but you know that something is partly wrong, then that is not your answer. Choose the thing that you don't even know what it is, because chances are that's the answer. When you're doing true, false, again, something has to be completely true to be true, and it has to be completely false to be false. So if something is partially true, then you need to really kind of think about that and take that into account when you're answering your question. Again, watch for the qualifiers. And they do this typically in true false. This is always true. This is never true. This happens for none of the time. And then watch for negatives. So not, none, never. These things, then mean that you have to look for the opposite. And this can be somewhat confusing to students, especially if you're not a native English speaker. Negatives can be really, really tricky. If you're not a native English speaker and you're confused by a negative, or even if you are a native English speaker and you're confused by a negative, go up and ask the professor. Like if they're not going to answer it, they're not going to answer it, right? But never just sit there. Just go up and say, hey, I'm reading this as XYZ. Am I correct? And they'll usually tell you if you're reading it correctly or not. For essays, again, I want you to outline your answer before you start writing. So know what you're going to cover. And so what I would say is go to the instructions and underline or highlight every piece that the instructions say have to be included. So I want you to cover the birth of this movement. I want you to cover the key people who are important to this movement. I want you to talk about the social issues that were involved. Underline all of those so that you make sure that every single one of those pieces is in your essay. Watch your time. This is really important with essays because you can really lose track of your time. You need to be concise. And so that's why an outline is really helpful, because if you know you have A, B, C, D, and you've only got 5 minutes left and you're only on B, you're going to run out of time. So outlining your answer can make sure that you at least get a little bit down for everything that you want to write about. And then again, go back to the actual essay question and double check that you've hit everything before you submit. I want you also to choose what to go back to and be very intentional about this. So a lot of times we save the last 10 minutes to go back to questions that we weren't sure about. But sometimes some people have a hard time deciding like which ones to go back to. And so they just end up going back to the beginning of their test and going through it chronologically, and then they miss things. So I want you to put a star next to questions that if you have a lot of time left, you'll come back to. They're not high priority. They're maybe low in points. You're fairly certain you got the right answer, but maybe just a little bit more thinking might help you. 2 stars would be, I'll come back to if I've got time, but 3 stars are high priority. I need to come back and spend a little bit more time on this question because maybe I need to really think if I've used the right formula, or I really need to think and make sure that I have completely understood what this question is asking. So that is everything. So I wish you best of luck in taking exams. I know it can cause a lot of anxiety and tension. Please, if you are eligible for accommodations on exams, utilize them. It can be really, really helpful. And exams can be worth a huge amount of your grade. And so you don't want to take a risk that you're going to not do well. I would say if you think you possibly will need accommodations, use them for your first exam. And then if you find you don't need them, you could go back to accessibility services and say, hey, I don't really need this anymore. And they can remove that, and then you can take your exams in the classroom. So anyway, best of luck to you and have fun taking your tests.